Start your day with Torah in Northwest London. Wednesday, 17th of Iyar, 18th of May, 32nd of Baomer. Rabbi David Robert Shlita, Lag Baomer. This week's Torah has been sponsored by family Brody. The first Simchas on the son of Avi Brody and Fegi Reich. Custom will take place tomorrow, Lag Baomer. He Rotzen Shimno Bayis Ne'emon Yisrael, L'Shem V'Lissi Lo.
Good? Yeah. Shalom Aleichem. It's nice to be back and to have the opportunity to share some Torah, especially on the eve of this interesting day, as was just discussed, like Baomer. I'm going to try and steer clear of some of that controversy and take a different route, if I may, because it is confusing. It is confusing as to exactly what happened. There's different Girusoyos, Yom Shemeis, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Yom Simchas. We're going to take a totally different day, we'll keep the same day, but we'll take a different route. And I'd like to start very much left of field and try and connect it to something that we see there are undercurrents of in Chazal. There are Svarim Akdoshim that point out a very interesting and rather bizarre gematria. That Yud Ches Iyar is which is of course the date of Lag Baomer, is the gematria of Amalek, 240, which seems to be rather bizarre and utterly random, as I think teenagers would say, until one remembers the Mechaber in Tov Chav Ches, who points out to us when he's doing the various simonim of the Luach, and he says Peleg Purim, the day of the week that is Purim, will always be the same day of the week as the following Lag Baomer. And of course, the Shulchan Aruch is not in the business of providing mnemonics so that we can organize our diaries. It means that in our Luach there is some conceptual basis which underpins both of these two. And let's try and understand this a little bit. As mentioned before, the mahus, the essence of what the simcha of Lag Baomer is, there are many different approaches, but we're going to take a different one. The Kaf HaChaim and the Chidah both bring the following: that this was the day that Rabbi Akiva began to teach the new set of Talmidim. Hoya ha'olam shomim, as the Gemara says. The world went back to Toihu, because the very Masorah, the Shalshelis of Masorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh was under threat, because all of his Talmidim died, until at Shabbat he found 5 new Talmidim and he started teaching them this new link in the chain of Shalshelis of Masorah HaTorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh began on Lag Baomer. Furthermore, they say that this was also a day that he gave smicha to these Talmidim. Where's the first time we find smicha? Moshe Rabbeinu with Yehoshua. How is it characterized? V'nasato mehoidecha olav. The hoid that was mentioned before in this week, Lag Baomer being hoid sheba hoid, and we'll come back to this. This process, the revelation and the continuation of the hoid, of the glory, of the kovod, of the yokar of Torah, was solemnized, was made concrete, and it was made secure on this day. So it's a day when the Masorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and interestingly, we don't have time for it now, it's actually done in sort of almost in reverse order, if you think about it. The Pnimius HaTorah, the Hoid Sheba Hoid, is written down. The Idra Zutta is written down. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai instructs Rabbi Abba to write it down. And this is 2 generations, or 1.5 generations before. Rebbe, who's a Talmud of a Talmud, who Eis Lasses Lashem writes down the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Mishnah. So when it is nigla and written down, it's kind of done in reverse order, which is something to be thought about. Okay, so let's try and find a mahalach incorporating Purim and its lessons to Lag Baomer and the continuation of the revelation of the deepest parts of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So the mahalach, of course, as everybody knows, from Pesach to Shavuos, is the mahalach from leaving Mitzrayim, being born as a nation, and elevating ourselves from the Omer, the Sa'irim, the Barley, the Machel, Behema, to become an Adam. B'mloi muvan hamila, to become an Adam, that we are then able to stand at Har Sinai, and the Rebbeinu Shalom should give man his Torah, which the Malachim absolutely cannot fathom. It makes no sense. Ma enosh kisiz kerenu ven Adam kisif gedenu. You're going to give Torah to man? You're turning man into an object of kovod and hadar. No. Torah, with all its hoid and its yokar and its kovod, belongs very firmly in the realm of shamayim and not with man. That is the challenge to the acceptance, or the giving over of Torah. Says the Maharal, Talmidi Rabbi Akiva died for 32 days, which is gematria covered, meaning that the impossibility of continuing to transmit Torah was the chisaron was in this sugya called kavod. What does that mean? So let's utilize a little bit the life and times of Rabbi Akiva and who he was to try and understand this. There's a medrash in a number of places which says, on the pasuk in Navi, "V'chol yokar ra'asa einoi," and in all the glory, "V'chol yokar ra'asa einai," his eye perceived. Zeh Rabbi Akiva. This refers to Rabbi Akiva because, as the medrash says, and it's a medrash in a number of different places, Dvarim shaloi niglu leMoshe niglu leRabbi Akiva. Ideas in Torah which were not revealed to Moshe were revealed to Rabbi Akiva. And how is that characterized? As kol yokar, the fullness of the yokar of the kavod of Torah. Let's go back to Purim for a second, and just to keep us on track, what is the climax, the apex of the Gilui, the revelation of Purim? La'Yehudim Osaira, v'Simcha, v'Sasoin, v'Yikar. Of course, it's v'Yikar. And the Yikar is the Tefillin Shebarosh, as Chazal say, and we will return to that. And this, of course, is the reversal of the Keri of Amalek. The Keri becomes Yikar. The Keri is happenstance, it's randomness, it's the nihilism, to be fancy for a minute. It's that nothing, nobody and nothing has any real intrinsic value at all. And of course, Yokar is 310. Think about what that word, where we come across that word. We'll come back to that. It is also, incidentally, of course, the gematria of Omer. Of Omer, 310. Osid HaKadosh Baruch Hu lehanchil l'chol tzadik v'tzadik, 310 oilamos. Shenem lehanchil oy havai yesh. There is. It's the opposite of the ayin of Amalek. Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. It is that there is. Hashem is b'kirbeinu. We have Yokar inside of us. That is who we are, and therefore we have the ability and the imperative and the obligation to be able to connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom and be makabel his Torah. We'll come back to that. And of course, no coincidence that Haman, the archetype of this nihilism, the one who has everything, v'chol zeh idenu shoveli, like Adam HaRishon, he has absolutely everything, but it's nothing because there's one Jew that doesn't, because my kavod is not substantiated. I don't get the kavod from one person in the whole world. And therefore, of course, on Tes Zayin Nisan, he is hung on the Eitz Hadas, according to the Medrash Talpios and others. Because that was the Eitz that started the whole thing off, Hamin Ha'etz. And why don't we hang people? Ki kilalas Elokim Tolui. Because a person who has inner worth, because they are B'Tselem Elokim, L'Solin Nivlosoi Al Ha'etz. Because that would be a violation of the Yokar and the Kavod of what it means to be an Adam. And therefore, of course, Adam HaRishon, the Gemara in Sanhedrin Lamed Ches, Adam HaRishon, when he sins, says the Gemara, Odom biyakar v'loyolin nimshal kabehemois nidmu. It invokes the posuk in Tehillim, because what Odom did by being sorach, again interesting lashon, smelling, that's the opposite of yokar, of kavod, of being mechubad. Odom Harishon didn't last many hours at all after being created, and he didn't manage to be yokar with his yokar. He did not manage to value his own yokar, and instead he sought to do the aveira of the Eitz Hadas. V'odom biyakar bal yolin. He didn't remain overnight with his yokar. The same idea that is invoked with leisolin nivlosei alo eight, because it's a person is b'tzelem elikim and has his yokar. And of course, perhaps the derech tzachos, the derech drush, it occurred to me that Odom Harishon, that David HaMelech, who of course realizes that he has absolutely nothing of his own. His years come from Odom. Odom being Rosh Tevis, Odom David Mashiach. He is Mesakein. He is the one that is Mesakein this lack of awareness of one's own worth. That's pshat in first of all in the Rambam. In the famous Rambam at the end of the Hilchos Lulav, when he's talking about Kavod HaTorah, David HaMelech is the paradigm. David HaMelech is the one who says, David HaMelech is the one who, because he recognizes that he is but a vehicle for Kvod Shamayim, he lives that to the full, and he becomes the paradigm for Kavod. And therefore he gets up in the morning, and what does he say? Ura Kavodi! He has succeeded where Odom Harishon failed. Ha'odom biyakar bal yonin, and he wakes up early in the morning to sing Zmiras v'Tishbachos to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and he talks to himself in the third person. The Baomer in Hakdama, famous Baomer, talks about the fact that the essence of who we are is our neshama. And what is the neshama called? L'ma'an yizamercha chavoid v'lo yidoy. Your neshama is a shtick kavod. That's what it is. And David HaMelech turns to his own neshama, turns to himself in the third person, recognizing his self-worth, recognizing that he is a neshama, he is a vehicle for transmitting and reflecting kavod shamayim. And he says, Ura kavodi, get up my kavod, we've done our job. We've stayed overnight, we've managed, unlike David HaMelech, unlike Odom, we've stayed overnight. Ura kavodi, he says. And of course, again, only in the Olam HaMachshava, but he lives 70 years, and he's the one that takes, Amalek is 240, B'gematria Sophic. You add on David's years, and you come to Yokar, of course, you come to Yesh. He's Masakin that. Because really all the world is, and all we are is, a Beis HaMedrash of Kavod. There is only one set of values, and that is Mechubadut. The recognition that there is a Borei Olam, and that he infused into us the ability to connect to him. The opposite of the Hayesh Hashem Bekirbeinu im Ayin. Midah Keneged Midah, how do we win that Milchama against Amalek? Because we're Mishabdim Es Libam, that's all we needed to do. That's the Midah Keneged Midah. We questioned, or Amalek rather made us question our own self-worth. The Sophic, which is Amalek, 240, is not that he doubts the Rebbeinu Shalom. Amalek is a grosser mammon. In fact, it's the other way around. He's so apparently is marif the Rebbeinu Shalom that he cannot accept that we, lowly people, mo enosh. That's what he says. You're going to connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu. Are we? Yes, there is Hashem b'kirbeinu. How do we know? Because we were doing ma'asim chitzoniim. We were fighting a physical war, whilst at the same time internally being, as the Mishnah says, Meshabdim es libam la'avim shabash omayim, and then we won. That was a clear demonstration that Yesh Hashem b'kirbeinu. There is Yesh. Again, 310. And we have this covered inside of us. That's what it means to be a mensch. So the Hezbollah Hadova, to take this maybe a little bit further, which is really, really important, is Pshat in the Mishnah. Mishnah, Ezehu Mechubad HaMechabed Es Habriyos. Says the Mishnah, who is Mechubad, who is deserving of honor, who is honorable, right? About the honorable gentleman or the right honorable, who is Mechubad HaMechabed Es Habriyos. Understand the Mishnah, Pshat in the Mishnah, the proof text. We need a proof that somebody who is Mechubad is somebody who is Mechabed others. Shenema, says the Novi, Ki Mechabdai Achabed Uvoizai Yekolu. Says the Rabbeinu Shalom, those who are Mechabed me, Mechabdai Achabed, I will be Mechabed. The proof text for the Mishnah. What is the idea that we're trying to prove? That if you're Mechabed another person, that you are Mechubad. And then the proof text is, the Rabbeinu Shalom says, anybody who's Mechabed me, we're not talking about being Mechabed Hashem, we're talking about being Mechabed Brios. The answer is Poshet. It says it in the tin. It says it on the tin. What's the word? Brios. What does it mean to be a Beria? It means there is a Boire and therefore you are a Nivra. You're not just a random mutation of some DNA that happens to find its way here. Randomness, keri, mikre, no meaning, nihilism. It's the exact opposite. You are a shtik kavod. Ki mechabdai achabed, you are a barrier. You are a creature. You are created. That means there is a boire. And therefore, the root and the yesod really of treating another person with the dignity that they deserve is because of who they are, is the recognition that they are a shtik kavod. To be an Adam is to be somebody who has the self-recognition of who you really are, and you see that in others. And until that process starts, game over. There's nothing to talk about. Nimshal, and that's why the other pasuk in that capital in Tehillim, of course, is Adam bikar v'lo yovin. Once it says v'lo yolin, but another says v'lo yovin nimshal kabehemos nidbu. Or in the famous words of Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon at his Akdama to Shas, that if a person is not activating his seichel, then you're like a behemoth. The Rebbeinu doesn't speak to behemoths. There's no Torah. And that's the whole of Sefer Bereshis. Zeh Sefer Toldos Adam, man fell off the map. There was no Adam. The Tselem Elokim became progressively corroded and eroded with each subsequent failing, whether it's a Der Enosh or the Der Amabul and Mitzrayim and Sodom, and until there was nothing left. Kimat. And then along comes the first Adam. Behibaram ba'Avraham. He comes along and he recognizes Hidativ l'manashi yitzavos bonavis beis achor v'shomru derech Hashem lasis tzedakah mishpat. Always bothered me. What's v'shomru derech Hashem la'asais? La'asais is always mitzvah saseh. What's v'shomru? Tzedakah and mishpat are positive. Because it's the recognition that you actually have it inside of you and all you need to do is preserve it, maintain it, identify it, give it its provenance, its makor, this innate feeling that it is the right thing to do, tzedakah or mishpat. Where does that come from? That says the Ibn Ezra at the beginning of Seres HaDibros, and there's other Rishonim in this vein as well. And that's how we square, by the way, any tension between any form or feeling of innate morality and Torah. They're not at loggerheads. It's a progression. The first thing that needs to happen is, in Binyan HaAdam, is the recognition of what it means to be an Adam, is to be a Tselem Elokim, and that the Rebbeinu is matbiya into us some a priori moral ideas. But where does that come from? It's derech Hashem. But it's at the same time, it's the feeling of tzedakah mishpat. There's no contradiction whatsoever. And until that kavod that is inside is recognized and activated, until that point, there's nobody home. If that yokar is not there, there's no diam. Kal v'chayma when you're talking about Mesiras HaTorah, there's nothing to talk about. So if lo nohagu kovoid zelozeh, even if it's at the highest level, there cannot be a transmission of Torah for two reasons. Because there is nobody to transmit that Torah. There is no Adam. And it can't be Torah either. It's not just the Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar was not just all, fluffy and singing Kumbaya. The Vayichan, which is important. And Middle Amud Beis, of course, is Oyev Esabriyos. Forgot to mention, of course. Say the Balimos. If you go, not according to all the Girsais, but in the Memches Kinyonei HaTorah, the 32nd, is Oyev Esabriyos. Now, that makes sense. And when that is achieved, then the new Shalshelas of Torah can really start. But also in terms of Kabbalah Torah, the way Torah is designed, the way the Maharal puts it is, in a few places, is the Torah was designed for the Klal. And if you're not a chelik of the Klal and you don't feel part of the Klal, then there can be no Torah. The Gaon puts it differently. The Gaon in Mishlei says, Rabbis Bonois Osu Choyel. Choyel is 48, is the 48, the Memches Kinyonei HaTorah, and only Rabbis Bonois Osu Choyel. E.F. Shela Adam says the Gaon, that one person, you ever read, it's a Shrek when I get to Perek Vav, all the Kinyonei HaTorah, to be able, he says it's E.F. for one person to be Sholem in all of these Novos. Bonois HaTalmidei Chachamim, Rabbis Bonois, together, Osu Choyel, we can be Koina Torah. Because I might be Mitzvayim, perhaps, hopefully in one midah, and you in another, and you in another. And if we are together, and we are Nagu Kovid Zebazeh, which is the recognition that my Torah is by you and your Torah is by me, that's the Chacham Aloymed Mikol Adam, as Rabbi Yonah explains. And who better than Rabbi Akiva to personify this? He is able, or rather he is persuaded by his Eishes Chayil. He didn't even know he had it in him, but he is able to be persuaded by him that he has inside of him all of Torah Shabbat Peh, and based garnished. But as Rabbi Yonah says in that Mishnah, Ezu Chacham, Haloymid Mikol Adam, fascinatingly, he starts off and he says, Amru Chachmei HaUmos. He quotes the Chachmei HaUmos. He's demonstrating that you can be Loymid Mikol Adam. And he says that they say, and he quotes this approvingly, that somebody who knows nothing, but he's Oyev Esachochma, and he has a teshuka, deep-seated desire for it, is a Chacham. On the other hand, somebody who knows everything, but it has no real connection or desire to acquire and to achieve Chacham is a Tippish. That's Rebbe Akiva. He knew nothing, and Rachel was able to persuade him that you have inside of you a Mechubad. You realize what a job that was? She was Oisa Ritzain Bala. Bina La'itim says in a drasha. She created it, she made it. She made him realize that you have it inside of you. And she managed, and then he went ahead and he brought it out. He brought it out of himself, day after day after day, until he became. And he was Tznu Yumal, as the Gemara says in Ksubas. He was Mavra Al Midosav, as the Gemara says. Mishamei si bottle covered Torah, as it says in Sota. Es Hashem Elokecha Tira. They stopped. Shimon HaMasuni stopped. How can you continue that? No, the rabbis Talmidei Chachamim, because that's what a Talmud Chacham is meant to be, a manifestation and a representation of the Mechubadus of Torah as it fuses together with the Kavod, the Neshama of the Talmud Chacham, and it becomes one. Then that is an extension. That is Es Hashem Elokecha Tira. Mul, of course, the V'lo Yorei Elokim of Amalek. And therefore, on the day that he begins to teach his Talmidim, his new set of Talmidim, and he manages successfully to transmit that, there's no greater cover than that. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Rebbeinu Shalom, we'll finish with a beautiful Klei Yaakov. There's more to be said on the Sugya, but I just want to finish with a beautiful Klei Yaakov. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Rebbeinu Shalom, Hareini no es kvoidecha. The Rebbeinu Shalom puts in Benikras Hatzur, which, by the way, is connected to the Ma'ara of from Bayachai, which is another story. And he says, you can see that only the Kesher Tfilin Hero Le'onov. He was only able to see the Kesher Tfilin, which is the Daled of the Shin and Daled and Yud. But the Yesh, the Shai, Rabbi Akiva was Zoicha, that's Pshat in the Medrash, V'chol Yokar Ra'asa Eno. He was Zoicha through his life's journey to finish and to become part of the Chulu Alibid Rabbi Akiva, of the revelation of the depth, the Hoid Sheba Hoid, because that's who he was. And then through his Talmidim, the deepest parts of Torah Sheba'al Peh are preserved on this day, tomorrow, for all time. That's the V'chol Yokar. But the starting point, for us at least, and that's the connection to Purim, of course, the starting point for us in Olam HaAvodah is the recognition. So the sugya, the mahalach is a sugya of kavod. But kavod, not in the sense that it's usually understood. Kavod is and that's why it's the biggest moineya and mania. If you look at the Mesilas Yesharim, the end of Perek Yud Aleph, very, very important. After he's discussed chemda and all the other terrible midas, he says, but the one more than anything else is ego, is kavod. What does that actually mean? Why is that? That is because we somehow sense inside of us, without even realizing it, that there is something transcendental, there is something sublime, something that doesn't need to be expressed, except it comes out all wrong with my own personal ego and my needs and my wants, instead of stopping to realize and to recognize, first of all, in myself. If a person is not mechubad, then you can't be mechabed somebody else as a bria if you don't realize that you're not a bria. That's why the Maral and the Gaon always say that the Gimel Averis Chamurais, which are Kneged Yochiv, to yourself, other, and the Rebbeinu Shalom. So the other two are obvious. But Giloy Aroyos, back to Kerry, is fundamentally a betrayal of the kavod that you are an Odom. You are a dignified being, and to behave like that is kabehemos nidmu. And it's in that order. If the Tzuras HaOdom is not built up within ourselves and recognized within ourselves as being that barrier, as having that kavod, lamani zamercha kavod, and then being able to have that capacity to see it in others, seeing everybody as a barrier, and kal v'chomer in a yid, in Talmud Chacham, in a tzibur, to be able to be a makabel Torah, then and only then we have the answer to the malachim. It's nahoid chol hashamayim. No, ubeichol toiv yotzar kavod l'shmai. Because the Rebbe was a toiv, he created a mechubad barrier that has that ability to recognize it and see it in themselves and others, and thus be makabel Torah.